Right now, somewhere in northern Tanzania, a Hadza man is lying in the shade taking a nap. No, he isn't late for work. He didn't call in sick. And he definitely isn't pretending to look busy while his boss grabs another coffee. He's already finished working. The Hadza are one of the last hunter-gatherer societies still living in a way that resembles how humans spent most of our history. And feeding themselves takes them about 2.5 hours a day. Hunting, gathering, cooking. Everything they need to stay alive. Most of us spend 2.5 hours just commuting, answering emails, and sitting through a meeting whose only purpose is to schedule another meeting. The Hadza don't have bosses. They don't have office rent. They don't have Sunday night anxiety about Monday morning. But don't quit your job and order a bow just yet. Those 2.5 hours might mean hiking 20 miles under the African sun, digging rock-hard soil for edible roots, or tracking an animal that has absolutely no interest in becoming dinner. And hunting often ends with nothing at all. Still, the camp eats, people rest, children learn without schools, conflicts are settled without police, and anyone who becomes a little too successful gets publicly roasted before he accidentally invents middle management. Back in 1968, anthropologist Richard Lee calculated that the Jew/Hoansi Bushmen of the Kalahari spent only about 15 hours a week obtaining food. 15 hours. Some people spend that long trying to decide what to watch on Netflix. So, what did ancient humans actually do with the rest of their day? And how did a society with no money, no refrigerators, no laws, and no customer support avoid falling apart before lunchtime? You don't wake up to an alarm screaming like the world is ending. You wake up because the sky gets brighter, the air gets warmer, and people around the camp are already talking. You slept on an animal hide spread over flattened grass. No orthopedic mattress, no memory foam pillow. Around here, the memory stays in your own head. A small fire is still glowing nearby. Someone kept feeding it through the night. Not for the cozy atmosphere, not for Instagram, but because fire keeps you warm, keeps predators away, and generally discourages the local wildlife from making bad decisions. The camp holds about 25 or 30 people. You know every single one of them. Not just their names. You know who snores, who lies, who gets a little too generous with other people's meat, and who told an awful joke 3 years ago that nobody has let them forget. Your grandmother sleeps just a few feet away from your children, family, friends, former partners. Everyone lives close enough that personal space is mostly a geographic concept. Everything you own fits into a single bag. A bow, a handful of arrows, a digging stick, some animal hides, a water container. A few beads. Moving to another camp doesn't take 3 months. It takes about 15 minutes. Because every possession has to earn its place. If it's too heavy, too fragile, or needs its own storage room, you probably don't need it. This isn't minimalism, it's survival. Anthropologists call it an immediate return economy. Food gets collected, shared, and eaten. There are almost no long-term stockpiles, and if there are no stockpiles, they're hard to steal, hard to inherit, and even harder to turn into a family fortune. No warehouse, no warehouse manager, no warehouse manager's manager. But there is one kind of wealth everyone cares about: your reputation. Losing an arrow is inconvenient. Losing the trust of your camp is dangerous. That's why the first hour of the morning is usually spent talking. And this isn't idle gossip. It's the camp's news network. Courtroom, social media feed, security system, and HR department. just without passwords. Performance reviews, or emails that begin with friendly reminder. The first hour in camp isn't spent working, it's spent talking. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner found that Bushmen often spend several hours every single day in casual conversation. But don't picture people making small talk about the weather. These conversations are the camp's operating system. Who got a little too greedy yesterday? Who's fighting with their spouse? Who's been unusually quiet lately and might be getting sick? Who has started acting like the rules apply to everyone else? It's part news broadcast, part family group chat, part criminal justice system, part reputation scoreboard. If a man tried to hide meat, people laughed at him. If a woman broke a promise, word spread to neighboring camps surprisingly fast. And if someone became so difficult that nobody wanted them around anymore, the worst punishment arrived. People simply stopped inviting them. Today, someone might say, whatever, I'll just find new friends. Back then, finding new friends wasn't exactly easy. And surviving without a group? That usually wasn't an option. So reputation was worth more than anything you could carry. What's fascinating is that these societies had almost no formal leaders, but the group itself could apply social pressure so effectively. Modern HR departments might actually take notes. Which brings us to one of the strangest stories ever recorded by an anthropologist. Imagine bringing the greatest gift of your entire life, only to have everyone publicly insult you for it. In 1969, anthropologist Richard Lee decided to give the Jew/hoansi an extraordinary Christmas gift. He bought the biggest, fattest, most impressive ox he could find. He expected a celebration. Instead, everyone started making fun of it. That's a skinny little ox. There's barely any meat on it. You actually paid money for this? For weeks, that was all anybody talked about. Lee was completely confused. He had inspected the animal himself. It was enormous. Finally, he asked one of the elders what was going on. The answer surprised him. Whenever a hunter brings home a huge kill, the camp insults it. The bigger the animal, the harsher the jokes. Not because they're ungrateful, because success is dangerous. A successful hunter might start believing he's more important than everyone else. Today he brings home the meat. Tomorrow he starts giving orders. Next week he wants the best sleeping spot. Before long, he's explaining how everybody else should live. So they cut his ego down before it had a chance to grow. This wasn't humor for the sake of humor. It was politics. Simple politics. Cheap politics. And incredibly effective politics. It worked for thousands of years. Every joke carried the same message. You may have brought home the meat, but without everyone else, you're still just one person. The funniest part? Richard Lee never realized the camp was doing exactly the same thing to him. He brought the best gift anyone had ever seen, which meant his ego needed trimming too. And while the camp made sure nobody became a king, the hunters were already preparing for the one place where jokes couldn't help them. The hunt. By mid-morning, the men start getting ready to hunt. This is probably the part most people picture when they imagine ancient life. A spear, a chase, epic music, and some enormous animal politely waiting for its turn to die. Reality was less cinematic and much more exhausting. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe, who spent decades studying the Hadza, found that most hunters came home empty-handed. A major kill did not happen every day. Sometimes it happened only once in an entire week. Imagine going to work 7 days in a row, and maybe getting paid on Friday. Maybe. A hunter could cover nearly 20 miles in a single day, track a wounded animal for hours, lose the trail, find it again, then return to camp with one small bird, and a back that had officially filed a complaint. So the hunter's greatest advantage wasn't raw strength, it was patience and memory. He had to read the ground like a book. A bent blade of grass, a drop of blood, a hoof print most of us would mistake for an oddly shaped hole. And the bow did not work the way it does in movies. The arrow did not always need to kill immediately. Sometimes it only needed to break the skin. The tips were often coated with poison made from a plant known as the desert rose. Then came the longest part of the hunt. Waiting, following, not losing the animal, sometimes for hours. Hadza hunters have brought down animals as large as giraffes this way. But here is the real surprise. Everyone admired the hunters. The hunters got the stories. The hunters got the drama. But they were not the people feeding the camp most reliably. While the men were out chasing luck, the women were bringing back food almost every day. Not glamorous food. Not the kind of food people built heroic stories around. Just the kind that actually kept everyone alive. Among the Hadza, women provide more than half of the camp's calories. They go out in groups. They dig, gather berries, collect fruit, find tubers, search for honey, and return with food the camp can depend on. Meat is a celebration. Plant food is the schedule. There is an old anthropological joke. Men provide the feast. Women make sure everyone survives until the next one. But there is an even more surprising detail. The most productive food gatherers are often the grandmothers. Yes, the same people modern society might gently suggest should take it easy and develop an interest in gardening. Women in their 50s, 60s, and sometimes older still walk miles every day and bring back huge amounts of food. Scientists call this the grandmother hypothesis. Humans are one of the very few primates whose females live for decades after menopause. And one possible reason is simple. Grandmothers helped feed grandchildren. That gave younger mothers more time to care for infants and allowed the whole family to raise more children successfully. Meanwhile, the men were once again trying to convince an antelope to participate in a field experiment called "How long does arrow poison take to work?" So the most dependable providers were not always the young hunters. They were the women, and very often the older women. And following beside them were children, who, unlike most modern children, did not wait until adulthood before becoming useful. The children go everywhere with the adults, but nobody says, "All right, class, open your notebooks." Notebooks haven't been invented yet. Neither have PowerPoint presentations. A 3-year-old already carries a tiny digging stick trying to copy mom. By 6, many children can find food on their own. By 8, a Hadza boy might head into the bush with a small bow and come back carrying a bird. To us, that sounds like a parenting decision that would immediately trigger Child Protective Services. To them, it's Tuesday. Anthropologist David Lancy noticed something remarkable. In many traditional societies, children are rarely taught the way we think of teaching today. Adults don't lecture, they demonstrate. Children watch, they copy, they make mistakes, they play, then they copy again. Older kids look after the younger ones, teaching what they themselves learned only yesterday. If a toddler falls, the first person to help is often another child, not an adult. It's a surprisingly efficient system. No school buildings, yet learning happens all day long. No report cards, yet every evening life hands out grades anyway. Nobody asks, "When am I ever going to use this?" Because the answer is probably within the next 10 minutes. This is how humans learned for hundreds of thousands of years. But finding food is only half the job. The really interesting part begins when someone brings it back to camp. Because now comes a question humanity still hasn't completely solved. Who gets what? The first people return to camp before noon, and almost immediately, the food starts getting shared. Not because everyone is unbelievably generous, not because somebody organized a workshop on emotional intelligence, because being selfish was simply terrible economics. If a hunter killed a large animal, that meat did not belong to him. It belonged to the camp. In fact, the hunter himself often received one of the less desirable cuts. From the outside, it almost seems unfair. You spend all day walking, sweating, taking risks. You finally succeed. And then you watch somebody else walk away with the best piece. But the logic was rock solid. Today, you got lucky. Tomorrow, your neighbor will. The day after, maybe nobody will. Large amounts of meat spoil quickly. There are no refrigerators, no freezers, not even a container in the back labeled, "Don't touch, saving this for tomorrow." So the safest way to preserve food was to give it away. Anthropologists believe relationships like these helped shape the human brain itself. You had to remember who shared, who cheated, who showed up when things got difficult, and who mysteriously disappeared every time real work needed to be done. Your real savings account wasn't a cave full of supplies. It was your reputation. The more people willing to feed you tomorrow, the wealthier you were today. Generosity wasn't just a moral virtue. It was one of the smartest investments in the Stone Age. After lunch, the camp finally slows down. And now comes the part of the day that most modern people would probably call doing absolutely nothing. After lunch, the camp seems to hit pause. Not because everyone suddenly becomes lazy, because the sun is now making a very convincing argument against productivity. Nobody runs across the savannah just to prove they are committed to the job. People rest in the shade, repair arrows, weave baskets, fix straps, tell stories, laugh, and do something that might sound a little strange to modern ears. They spend long stretches of time going through each other's hair, looking for lice. Not exactly romantic, but anthropologists point out that grooming was about more than hygiene. It was also a way to spend time together, something like hugging, having a long conversation, or watching a series with someone you love, just without an ad break every 10 minutes. Physical contact is constant here. Children climb all over adults. Adults sit shoulder to shoulder. Nobody signs up for a weekend workshop to rediscover the healing power of human touch. And work has not disappeared. It is simply woven into the rest of life. You talk while repairing an arrow, watch a child while weaving a basket, tell jokes while stripping bark from a branch. There is no clear moment when life ends, and the workday begins. Which is why the modern question, "When do you relax?" might sound a little strange here. Work and rest are mixed together all day. But even in a camp like this, people still argue. And when a conflict became serious, they had a solution that would sound almost impossible today. Of course, hunter-gatherers were not saints. They got jealous, held grudges, gossiped, sometimes stole, sometimes fought. In other words, they were still human. But this is where things get unusual. Imagine becoming so tired of your neighbor that you decide to move. How long would that take today? Sell the apartment, deal with the mortgage, pack everything, hire movers, change your address. For an ancient hunter-gatherer, the process was much simpler. You put everything you owned into one bag and left, sometimes within 15 minutes. Anthropologists call this voting with your feet. If a conflict became unbearable, one person could simply move to another camp where relatives or friends lived. No courtroom, no lawyers, no property settlement. But this was not complete freedom. A bad reputation could travel faster than you did. If you lied constantly, refused to share, or caused trouble everywhere you went, the next camp might already know before you arrived. And eventually, the worst thing could happen. Nobody would take you in. Then you were truly alone. And on the savannah, loneliness is not a poetic phrase from a wellness podcast. It is dangerous. So the camp was held together not by fear of the law, but by fear of losing other people. And surprisingly, that system worked extremely well, as long as the group stayed small. Because nobody can personally know 1,000 people, not even with an excellent memory. And this is where the story quietly begins preparing for a completely different world. A world of villages, fields, stored food, and the first real bosses. But before that world arrives, night falls. By evening, the camp comes alive again. The hunters return. The women lay out the food they gathered, and the children race to tell stories in which each of them somehow defeated a bird roughly the size of an ostrich, even though the actual bird was closer to a very respectable pigeon. Around the fire, the conversations begin again. Who saw fresh animal tracks? Where water has appeared? Who is expecting a child? Who plans to move to another camp? Who told a story so funny that people will still be repeating it years later? And this is where something important becomes clear. Conversation was the main way knowledge survived. No books, no maps, no hard drives. Just the memory of living people. You also start to notice another rule. The camp is small for a reason. Usually 20 people, 30, sometimes 40. Roughly enough for everyone to know everyone else personally. Scientists have long debated whether the human brain has a natural limit on the number of stable social relationships it can maintain. One popular estimate is around 150. It's known as Dunbar's number. And if that estimate is even roughly correct, it explains something important. When everyone knows everyone, reputation works, jokes work, trust works. But when the group grows from 30 people to 3,000, remembering faces is no longer enough. You need rules, leaders, courts, taxes. Yes, these people had more free time, but they did not have antibiotics. They did not have surgeons. They did not have painkillers. And they definitely could not search, "Why has this been hurting for 3 days? A cut that would heal in a week today could once become fatal." Childbirth was far more dangerous than most of us can easily imagine. Infection did not care whether you were kind, useful, or deeply respected. It simply arrived, and often won. Child mortality was also devastatingly high, which is why the familiar claim that ancient people only lived to 30 is misleading. The average was dragged down by the enormous number of children who never reached adulthood. If someone survived the most dangerous early years, they had a real chance of growing old. But there were still no guarantees. One bad day, one injury, one bite, and the whole story could end. So hunter-gatherer life should not be romanticized. They did not discover a perfect society. They became extremely good at surviving in a world that was far more physically dangerous than ours. We traded that life for medicine, cities, electricity, and the ability to go an entire week without wondering whether food would appear. But the trade included something else. We left behind the social world that shaped the human brain for hundreds of thousands of years. And that may be why so much of life around an ancient camp still feels strangely familiar. Anthropologist Marshall Salins once described hunter-gatherers as the original affluent society. That sounds strange. How can anyone be affluent without a house, a refrigerator, or even a spare pair of pants? The answer is simple. Wealth is not always measured by how many things you own. Sometimes it is measured by how few things you need. Our ancestors were poorer than us in almost every material sense, but they had something that has become a genuine luxury: time. Constant human contact, daily movement, and a life surrounded by people they had known for years. Of course, nobody in their right mind would trade modern medicine for a digging stick, and very few people would volunteer to treat a broken leg with advice from an elder and a sincere wish for good luck. History rarely offers a choice between good and bad. Usually, it offers a trade. We gained safety, cities, science, technology, and paid for them with schedules, deadlines, bosses, and an endless stream of notifications. The strangest part is that our brains still remember a very different world. A world where the most valuable resource was not money, it was the people around you. And maybe that is why sitting beside a fire, talking with friends for hours, or spending an evening without a phone can create such a strange feeling, as if, for a moment, we have finally returned to the place we were built for.